The sun had just begun its slow descent, casting a golden hue over the small town of Redovan. The faint toll of the church bells resonated through the streets, signaling the start of the evening service at St. Matthew's Community Church. It wasn't a grand building by any means, but its modest stone facade and colourful stained glass windows held a deep significance for the townsfolk. For years, the church had been a sanctuary, not just for worship, but for those in need a refuge for the downtrodden and the forgotten. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with quiet activity. Children sat on wooden pews, whispering and giggling under the watchful eyes of their parents. Elderly parishioners, some with canes and walkers, shuffled to their usual spots near the front. A few teenagers, most of whom had been drawn into the church's youth programs by the persistent kindness of one particular woman, lingered near the back, fidgeting with their phones but staying respectfully silent. The faint sound of the choir rehearsing in the adjoining room added a harmonious backdrop to the scene. At the center of it all was Naomi King. A vibrant woman in her early 30s, Naomi moved through the room with a natural grace and quiet authority. Dressed in a simple yet elegant black dress, she exuded warmth and confidence. Her dark skin seemed to glow under the soft light streaming through the windows, and her braided hair was neatly tied back, giving her an air of both professionalism and approachability. Naomi was no stranger to hard work. As the leader of the church's outreach programs, she had dedicated her life to helping those society often overlooked, the children of broken homes, the teenagers teetering on the edge of gang life, and the adults struggling to piece their lives back together after years of hardship. Tonight was special. The church was hosting a community dinner, an event Naomi had spent weeks organizing. The goal was to provide not just food but hope, a sense of belonging for those who felt the world had turned its back on them. Volunteers bustled around her, setting tables and arranging plates, while Naomi ensured everything ran smoothly. Despite the chaos, she remained calm, her voice steady as she offered guidance and encouragement. "Mrs. Baker, let me help you with that," she said gently, taking a heavy casserole dish from an elderly woman who looked ready to collapse under its weight. "You should be sitting down, enjoying the evening, not lifting things." Mrs. Baker chuckled, shaking her head. "Naomi, you're too kind. But this old body still has a bit of strength left. Save it for the meal," Naomi replied with a wink, placing the dish on the serving table. "We need your stories tonight more than your labor." The room around them hummed with the chatter of guests arriving. Naomi's heart swelled as she noticed familiar faces, people she had worked with over the years mingling with newcomers. Many of the teenagers she had mentored stood off to the side, looking slightly out of place in the warm, familial atmosphere. She made a mental note to talk to them later, to remind them they belonged here just as much as anyone else. Outside, the evening air was crisp, a slight chill hinting at the approaching winter. On the street, Officer Derek Barnes sat in his patrol car, idly drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. Barnes was new to Redovan, having been recently transferred from a larger precinct in the city after several disciplinary issues had caused too much friction with his previous colleagues. His reputation had followed him here, a man known for his quick temper, abrasive personality, and deeply ingrained biases that often dictated how he treated the people he was supposed to protect. The transfer hadn't humbled Barnes. If anything, it had emboldened him. He saw Redovan as a backwater town, a place beneath him, and its residents as nothing more than potential troublemakers. He often justified his heavy-handed tactics with the notion that he was keeping order, but in truth, he relished the control his badge gave him. As he scanned the streets, his gaze fell on the brightly lit church. His lip curled slightly. To him, places like that were nothing more than breeding grounds for problems. He'd seen it too many times before, churches in low-income neighborhoods harboring what he saw as undesirables, runaways, addicts, and criminals. The sight of a group of teenagers lingering outside the building only reinforced his assumptions. "What are they up to?" he muttered to himself, narrowing his eyes. He reached for his radio, debating whether to call for backup, but decided against it. He didn't need help for this. It was just a group of kids, he could handle it himself. Inside the church, Naomi had just finished checking the dinner arrangements when one of the teenage boys, Marcus, hurried up to her, his expression uneasy. Marcus was one of her more challenging cases, a bright young man who had fallen in with the wrong crowd but was slowly finding his way back, thanks to Naomi's relentless support. "Miss King," he said in a low voice, glancing toward the entrance. "There's a cop outside. He's been sitting there for a while, just watching." Naomi's brow furrowed. She had dealt with police officers before, some kind and cooperative, others less so. Still, the presence of a patrol car outside the church wasn't unusual, especially on nights like this when there was a lot of foot traffic. She decided not to jump to conclusions. "Thank you, Marcus," she said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Stay inside and don't worry. I'll handle it." Naomi stepped outside, the cool air hitting her as she approached the patrol car. Barnes watched her through the windshield, his expression unreadable. As she drew closer, she could feel his gaze sizing her up, searching for something to criticize, something to justify his presence. She stopped a few feet from the car, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp. "Good evening, officer," she said, her tone polite but firm. "Is there something I can help you with?" Barnes stepped out of the car, his tall, imposing figure illuminated by the street lamp. He didn't answer immediately, instead letting his eyes sweep over her. Naomi stood her ground, unflinching, even as she felt the weight of his scrutiny. "Evening," he finally said, his tone curt. "What's going on here? Lot of people coming and going. Looks like a party." "It's a community dinner," Naomi replied. "We host it every month to bring people together and provide support for those in need." Barnes raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a slight sneer. "Support, huh? And who exactly are you supporting? Bunch of kids looking for trouble?" Naomi's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. "We're supporting members of our community, officer. Everyone deserves a place where they feel welcome." Barnes took a step closer, his presence almost suffocating. "You sure about that? Or are you just covering for someone? Places like this tend to attract problems." Naomi held his gaze, her voice unwavering. "If you have any concerns, officer, you're welcome to come inside and see for yourself. But I assure you, we have nothing to hide." For a moment, Barnes didn't respond. He seemed to weigh his options, his eyes flicking toward the church doors. Then, without a word, he brushed past her, heading inside. Naomi followed, her heart pounding but her resolve steady. She didn't know what Barnes was looking for, but she had a sinking feeling that his presence would change everything about this night. As Derek Barnes stepped through the church doors, the warm hum of activity inside came to an abrupt halt. Conversations trailed off, the faint sounds of laughter and the clinking of plates fading into a heavy silence. All eyes turned to the towering figure of the officer, his uniform stark against the soft, welcoming colors of the room. His presence carried an almost tangible weight, one that made the younger children instinctively shrink back into their seats and sent a ripple of unease through the adults. Barnes swept his gaze over the room, his expression hard and unreadable, though a faint flicker of disdain crossed his face as he took in the scene. The smell of freshly cooked food filled the air, and the sight of the long communal tables laden with casseroles, salads, and bread rolls didn't fit the narrative he'd constructed in his mind. Still, the group of teenagers standing near the back of the room caught his attention. They whispered amongst themselves, their postures defensive, as if they expected trouble, and trouble was precisely what Barnes had come looking for. Naomi King followed closely behind him, her heart pounding but her face calm. She could feel the tension radiating from the congregation, their unspoken questions hanging in the air. Why is he here? What does he want? She couldn't let this escalate. Not here. Not tonight. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, placing herself between Barnes and the uneasy crowd. "Officer Barnes," she said, her voice firm but measured. "This is a community dinner. Families, neighbors, and volunteers gathering to support one another. If you have concerns, I'm happy to address them, but I ask that you speak to me directly." Barnes barely acknowledged her, his sharp eyes scanning the room for any sign of impropriety. His hand rested casually on the radio clipped to his chest, a subtle but deliberate gesture that sent a chill through the room. He wasn't here to talk, he was here to assert control. "I've had complaints," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Anonymous reports about illegal activity in the area, drug deals, gang recruitment, that sort of thing." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a mixture of disbelief and quiet outrage. Naomi's stomach tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had dealt with accusations like this before, thinly veiled attempts to discredit the work she was doing, to cast doubt on the value of creating a safe space for young people. But this felt different. Barnes wasn't just an outsider looking for trouble, he was actively trying to create it. "This is a church," she replied, her voice unwavering. "The only activity happening here tonight is fellowship and service to the community. If someone's misled you, I assure you it has nothing to do with us." Barnes smirked, a small, cruel twist of his lips. "Is that so?" he drawled, taking a slow step forward. Funny how places like this always seem to attract the wrong crowd. The room tensed further. One of the teenagers, Marcus, shifted uneasily, his eyes darting between Barnes and Naomi. Barnes caught the movement and honed in on it like a predator spotting wounded prey. He pointed a finger at Marcus, his voice sharp. "You," he barked. "What's your name?" Marcus froze, his face draining of color. He glanced at Naomi, silently pleading for guidance, but before she could intervene, Barnes took another step closer, towering over the boy. "I asked you a question," Barnes snapped. "Don't make me ask again." "His name is Marcus," Naomi interjected, her voice cutting through the officer's harsh tone. She stepped between Barnes and the teenager, her stance protective. "And he's under my care tonight. If you have questions, they go through me." Barnes straightened, his smirk fading into something colder, more dangerous. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by a woman who seemed so at ease in defying him. For a moment, the room felt like it might implode under the weight of his silence. "I don't think you understand how this works," he said finally, his tone low and menacing. "When I ask a question, I expect an answer. Now step aside." Naomi didn't move. Her voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it as she replied, "I understand perfectly. But unless you have a warrant or probable cause, I suggest you reconsider how you're addressing members of this congregation." The air crackled with tension. Barnes stared at her, his jaw tightening, as if he were deciding whether to escalate further. Then, without warning, he reached out and grabbed Marcus by the arm, pulling him forward. "What's in your pockets, kid?" Barnes demanded, his voice dripping with suspicion. "Let's see what you're hiding." Marcus yelped, fear flashing across his face, and Naomi's composure finally cracked. She grabbed Barnes's wrist, her grip firm, and forced his hand away from the boy. "That's enough," she said, her voice ringing out with authority. "You're out of line, officer." Barnes turned on her, his face a mask of fury. The congregation collectively held its breath as the confrontation reached a boiling point. Naomi stood her ground, meeting his glare with unwavering defiance. "Don't you dare touch me," Barnes growled, his voice trembling with barely restrained anger. "You have no idea who you're messing with." "And neither do you," Naomi shot back, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "This is my church. These are my people, and I won't let you bully them." For a moment, Barnes seemed stunned by her boldness, but the shock quickly gave way to rage. He stepped closer, his posture aggressive, and raised his hand as if to make a point or a threat. Before anyone could react, the sound of a chair scraping against the floor broke the silence. From the back of the room, a man rose slowly to his feet. His presence was commanding, his movements deliberate. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with silver streaks in his close-cropped hair and an air of quiet authority that seemed to fill the space around him. Lionel King, Naomi's father, had been sitting unnoticed among the crowd, watching the events unfold with a calm intensity. Now, as he stepped forward, his gaze locked onto Barnes with the precision of a laser. "That's enough," Lionel said, his voice low but firm, carrying the weight of decades of experience. "Step away from my daughter." Barnes hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he sized up the older man. "And who the hell are you supposed to be?" he sneered. Lionel didn't answer immediately. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a worn but unmistakable badge. The room seemed to collectively exhale as the realization hit. Lionel King wasn't just a concerned father, he was a retired FBI agent. A man with years of experience dismantling corruption and bringing down dangerous individuals. "I'm someone who knows exactly how far out of line you've stepped," Lionel said, his voice calm but laced with a quiet menace. "Now I suggest you leave before you dig yourself into a hole you can't climb out of." The color drained from Barnes's face, but he masked his unease with bluster. "I don't take orders from you," he snapped, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "This is my jurisdiction." Lionel took another step forward, his presence utterly unshakable. "And yet, here you are, harassing innocent people in a house of worship. I wonder what your superiors would think of that." The room fell into an uneasy silence as the two men locked eyes, the tension between them palpable. Naomi watched her father, a mixture of relief and apprehension washing over her. She knew Lionel wasn't a man to back down from a fight, but she also knew that Barnes wasn't the type to walk away gracefully. The catalyst had been set. What had started as a quiet evening of fellowship had transformed into a standoff, and the true consequences of that night were just beginning to unfold. The silence that followed Lionel King's commanding voice was deafening. It hung thick in the air, heavy with unspoken words and raw tension. Officer Derek Barnes, his face flushed with the remnants of his anger, squared his shoulders and stared down Lionel, as if trying to reassert some semblance of authority. But there was something in Lionel's calm, unwavering demeanor that Barnes couldn't shake, a quiet power that unsettled him far more than he would ever admit. Naomi stepped slightly to the side, her heart pounding as she watched the exchange. She had seen her father in this mode before, cool, composed, and dangerously calculating. It was a side of him that rarely surfaced, but when it did, it was unyielding. Barnes, however, was not one to back down easily. His ego wouldn't allow it, not here, not in front of a room full of witnesses. "I don't care who you are," Barnes said, his voice a low growl as he pointed a finger at Lionel. "This is my scene, and you're interfering with a police investigation." Lionel tilted his head slightly, his expression remaining calm, almost amused. "Investigation," he repeated, his tone light but carrying a sharp edge. "What exactly are you investigating here, Officer Barnes? A community dinner? A room full of families and volunteers? Or perhaps you're just looking for someone to blame because your ego needs feeding?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The congregation, emboldened by Lionel's confidence, began to shift, their initial fear replaced by a growing sense of solidarity. For the first time that evening, Barnes felt the balance of power slipping out of his grasp, and he didn't like it. Not one bit. Barnes took a step closer to Lionel, invading his personal space in a move clearly meant to intimidate. But Lionel didn't budge. He stood firm, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his eyes locked onto Barnes's with a piercing intensity. "You've got a lot of nerve," Barnes said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Walking in here, thinking you can tell me how to do my job. Maybe you were someone important once, old man, but now you're just another face in the crowd, and you'd do well to remember that." Naomi's fists clenched at her sides, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. But before she could speak, Lionel raised a hand, signaling her to hold back. He wasn't done yet. "Just another face in the crowd," Lionel repeated, as if tasting the words. His lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "That's an interesting way to put it, Officer Barnes. Tell me, do you usually handle situations like this with such grace and professionalism? Or is tonight a special occasion?" Barnes's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, his hand hovered near the radio on his shoulder, as if he were contemplating calling for backup, but he hesitated. Calling for reinforcements would be an admission that he couldn't handle the situation on his own, and his pride wouldn't allow that. Instead, he turned his attention back to Naomi, his eyes narrowing. "Your father likes to talk," he said, his voice hard. "But you're the one who started this, defying an officer interfering with an investigation. You think you're untouchable because Daddy's here to protect you." Naomi stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "No one is defying you, Officer Barnes. What we're doing is standing up for ourselves and our community, something you clearly don't understand. You walked into this church looking for trouble, and now you're trying to create it because you can't admit you were wrong." Barnes's face turned a deeper shade of red. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Lionel spoke again, his tone sharp and cutting. "Enough," Lionel said, his voice slicing through the tension like a knife. "We're done playing your game, officer. You've overstepped your bounds and you know it. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave this church, and you're going to leave these people in peace. Or we can take this to the next level. Your choice." The room fell silent again, all eyes on Barnes as he wrestled with his next move. His mind raced, his thoughts clouded by anger and the gnawing realization that he was losing control. He couldn't leave now, not without looking weak. But the weight of Lionel's words, combined with the quiet strength of the congregation, made him hesitate. For the first time that night, he felt a flicker of doubt. But then his ego kicked in. "Is that a threat?" Barnes asked, his voice low and dangerous. He took another step toward Lionel, his chest puffed out in a display of false bravado. "Because I don't take kindly to threats. Not from you, not from anyone." Lionel didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them until they were mere inches apart. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that made Barnes's stomach churn. "It's not a threat," Lionel said. "It's a fact. You don't belong here, and the longer you stay, the worse this is going to get for you." So I suggest you think very carefully about your next move." The two men stared each other down, the air between them charged with unspoken tension. For a moment it seemed like Barnes might actually back down. But then something shifted. Perhaps it was the murmurs from the crowd, the weight of their collective judgment pressing down on him. Perhaps it was the simmering rage that clouded his better judgment. Whatever the reason, Barnes made his move. In a blur of motion, Barnes reached out and shoved Lionel hard in the chest, sending the older man stumbling back a step. The room erupted in gasps and cries of outrage, but Lionel didn't lose his footing. He straightened, his expression calm but his eyes blazing with a cold fury. Naomi rushed to her father's side, her heart pounding in her chest. "Dad," she began, but Lionel held up a hand, silencing her. "I'm fine," he said, his voice steady. He turned his gaze back to Barnes, his calm demeanor unnerving. "But you, Officer Barnes, you just made the biggest mistake of your life." Barnes sneered, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "Is that so?" he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "And what are you going to do about it, old man?" Lionel didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his movements deliberate. The room fell silent once more as everyone watched, their breath caught in their throats. When Lionel finally spoke, his voice was low, measured, and chillingly calm. "You don't know who I am," he said, his words deliberate. "But you're about to find out." Before Barnes could respond, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension. The congregation turned toward the doors as the flashing lights of additional patrol cars illuminated the stained glass windows. Barnes's smirk faltered, and for the first time that night, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "Looks like your reinforcements are here," Lionel said, his tone almost casual. "Why don't we see what they think of your little display of authority?" Barnes stiffened, his mind racing as the weight of the situation finally began to sink in. He was in over his head, and he knew it. But backing down now would mean admitting defeat, a blow his pride couldn't take. As the doors swung open and more officers entered the room, Barnes turned to Lionel, his expression a mixture of anger and desperation. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low. Lionel smiled faintly, his eyes never leaving Barnes's. "Oh, I know," he replied. "It's just getting started." The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, their wailing piercing through the night like a warning bell. The tension inside the church was palpable, a heavy weight that pressed down on everyone present. Derek Barnes's smirk faltered as the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the stained glass windows, casting fractured patterns of light onto the congregation. His bravado was beginning to crack, though he refused to let it show. Lionel King stood motionless, his broad shoulders squared, his piercing gaze locked on Barnes. Despite the chaos brewing around them, Lionel exuded a calm authority that commanded the room. Naomi stood at his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her expression a mixture of concern and quiet resolve. She knew her father well enough to recognize the storm building beneath his composed exterior. The heavy wooden doors of the church swung open with a loud creak, and two officers stepped inside, their faces etched with confusion and unease. One of them, a younger man with a nervous energy, glanced around the room, taking in the scene, the tense congregation, the tables laden with food, and Barnes standing stiffly in the center of it all, his hand resting dangerously close to his holstered weapon. Officer Barnes, the older of the two newcomers, said, his voice cautious, "We got a call about a disturbance here. What's going on?" Barnes straightened, his chest puffing out in a feeble attempt to reassert his authority. "Nothing I can't handle," he said curtly, though the tightness in his voice betrayed him. "These people were acting suspiciously. I was investigating." The officer's gaze flickered to Lionel, who remained silent but radiated an undeniable presence. "And who's this?" the officer asked, nodding toward him. Before Barnes could respond, Lionel stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm Lionel King," he said evenly, his voice carrying across the room. "Retired FBI, and I'd like to know why this officer felt the need to harass a church full of innocent people." A murmur rippled through the congregation at Lionel's words. For many, this was the first time they realized just who Naomi's father was. The revelation brought a new wave of hope and curiosity, though Barnes's face darkened with barely concealed rage. "Retired FBI," the younger officer repeated, his brows furrowing. "Sir, is that true?" Lionel didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his pocket and produced a small leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal his badge. Though worn from years of use, the emblem still carried the weight of authority. The older officer examined it briefly before nodding, his demeanor shifting. "Yes," Lionel said calmly, returning the badge to his pocket. "And I've seen enough tonight to know that Officer Barnes here has grossly overstepped his authority. He barged into this church, disrupted a community event, and assaulted both my daughter and a young man under her care, all without a shred of evidence or probable cause." The room fell silent, all eyes on Barnes as the weight of Lionel's words settled over him. For a moment, his hand twitched near his weapon, as if considering some reckless move, but he thought better of it. Instead, he squared his jaw and glared at Lionel. "They're lying," Barnes said through gritted teeth. "This whole place is a front for something. Drugs, gangs, I don't know what yet, but I'll find out." "Drugs?" Naomi interjected, her voice ringing with incredulity. "Officer Barnes, this is a church. These are families, children and volunteers. You're grasping at straws because you don't want to admit you were wrong." Barnes turned on her, his expression venomous. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job," he spat. "You think you're above the law because your father used to flash a badge. Newsflash, that doesn't mean a damn thing here." Lionel took a slow step forward, his presence looming. "Be very careful, Officer Barnes," he said, his tone dangerously low. "You're treading on thin ice. And if you're not careful, it will crack beneath you." The older officer, sensing the escalating tension, stepped between the two men. "All right," he said firmly, raising his hands. "Let's all take a breath. Officer Barnes, I think it's best if you step outside with us for a moment." Barnes hesitated, his fists clenching at his sides. He didn't want to leave, it would look like a retreat. But the other officers were watching him closely now, and the murmurs of the congregation were growing louder. Reluctantly, he turned on his heel and strode toward the door, the younger officer trailing behind him. The older officer lingered for a moment, his gaze meeting Lionel's. There was a flicker of respect in his eyes, though it was tempered by caution. "Sir," he said quietly, "I'd advise you and your congregation to stay calm. Let us handle this." Lionel gave a small nod, though his expression remained stony. "I'll stay calm," he said, "as long as your officer does the same." The officer nodded once before following his colleagues outside. The doors closed behind him with a heavy thud, leaving the church in a charged silence. The congregation began to murmur amongst themselves, their voices a mixture of fear, anger, and disbelief. Naomi turned to her father, her voice hushed. "Dad," she said, her brow furrowing, "what do we do now?" Lionel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Now," he said, his voice steady, "we wait. But be ready. This isn't over." Outside, Barnes paced back and forth on the church steps, his face a mask of fury. The younger officer stood nearby, clearly uncomfortable, while the older officer tried to reason with him. "Barnes," the older man said, his tone firm, "you need to calm down. This situation is already out of hand. and if you push it any further, it's going to blow up in your face." "I'm not backing down," Barnes snapped, his voice seething with rage. "That old man thinks he can walk in here and make me look like a fool. No chance. I'm going to prove he's hiding something. I'll dig up every piece of dirt on him, his daughter, and this damn church." The older officer sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Listen to yourself. This isn't about the law anymore, it's about your pride. You need to walk away before you do something you can't take back." But Barnes wasn't listening. His mind was already spinning with plans, fueled by a toxic mix of anger and humiliation. He couldn't let this go, not after Lionel had challenged him in front of everyone. He needed to regain control, no matter the cost. Back inside the church, Lionel stood near the altar, his eyes scanning the room as he took stock of the situation. The congregation had begun to settle, though the tension lingered like a storm cloud. Naomi watched her father closely, her concern growing. "Dad," she said quietly, "what are you thinking?" Lionel turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I'm thinking that man won't stop until he gets what he wants," he said. "And what he wants is to tear us down." Naomi's jaw tightened. "So what do we do?" Lionel's eyes darkened, a flicker of something cold and calculating passing over his face. "We prepare," he said simply, "and we make sure that when he comes back, he finds exactly what he's looking for and more." As the night wore on, the congregation slowly began to disperse, many lingering to offer their support to Naomi and Lionel. But beneath the surface, an undercurrent of unease remained. They all knew this wasn't over. Barnes had left, but he would return, and when he did, the true battle would begin. The stillness outside the church was deceptive. The distant hum of the patrol cars' engines lingered in the air, a reminder that the night was far from over. Derek Barnes stood by the open trunk of his cruiser, his posture rigid, his hands gripping the edge with enough force to turn his knuckles white. His mind churned with anger and humiliation, replaying Lionel King's words over and over again like a relentless drumbeat. The man had humiliated him, stripped him of control, and done it all in front of a crowd. Barnes couldn't let that stand. Inside the church, Lionel King wasn't fooled by the quiet. He had seen men like Barnes before, the type who couldn't handle losing power, who doubled down on their mistakes rather than admit fault. Lionel knew that the night's confrontation was far from over. He could feel it in the way the tension lingered in the air, in the nervous glances of the remaining congregation members as they prepared to leave. This wasn't a retreat. It was a prelude. Naomi, who had been helping clean up the remnants of the evening's dinner, approached her father with cautious steps. She recognized the look on his face, the careful calculation, the way his jaw tightened just slightly when he was deep in thought. He was planning something. "Dad," she said softly, drawing his attention. "What's going on? You're not telling me everything." Lionel glanced at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment he hesitated, as if weighing whether to share his thoughts. Finally he sighed and gestured for her to sit beside him in one of the pews. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low. "Barnes isn't the type to back down. Men like him, they don't know how to walk away. He's going to come back, and when he does, it won't just be to throw his weight around." Naomi frowned, her heart sinking. "What do you mean? What's he going to do?" Lionel's gaze hardened. "He's going to try to destroy us. He'll dig into our lives, look for anything he can use to discredit us. And if he doesn't find something, he'll make it up. He'll escalate this until he feels like he's won." Naomi's stomach twisted at her father's words. She wanted to argue, to say that no one could get away with that kind of abuse of power, but deep down, she knew he was right. She had seen it before in the stories of her friends, in the way systems were manipulated to silence people who stood up to authority. "So what do we do?" she asked quietly. Lionel's expression darkened, and for the first time that evening, a flicker of something cold and dangerous crossed his face. "We prepare," he said simply. Outside, Barnes was already setting his plan in motion. He had stepped away from his cruiser and now stood with the two officers who had responded to the scene earlier. The older officer, Sergeant Davis, crossed his arms over his chest and gave Barnes a hard look. "Barnes," Davis said, his tone firm, "you need to let this go. You're making this personal, and that's a dangerous game to play." Barnes rounded on him, his face twisted in fury. "Personal? Are you kidding me? That man walked in here like he owned the place, called me out in front of an entire room of people, and made me look like an idiot. He thinks he's untouchable just because he used to wear a badge. Well, I'm not letting him get away with it." Davis shook his head, exasperated. "This isn't about you. It's about the law. And unless you've got evidence of actual wrongdoing, you're just making things worse." "I'll find evidence," Barnes snapped, his voice sharp. "I know there's something going on in that church. Drugs, gangs, something. And I'm going to expose it." The younger officer, clearly uncomfortable, shifted his weight from one foot to the other but said nothing. Davis, however, wasn't willing to let it drop. "You're not thinking straight," Davis said, his voice rising slightly. "You're letting your ego drive this, and it's going to blow up in your face. Walk away now, Barnes." "That's an order." Barnes froze, his jaw tightening as his gaze locked onto Davis. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually listen, but then his pride took over, and he shook his head. "No," he said, his voice low and venomous. "I'm not walking away. Not until I put that man in his place." With that, he turned on his heel and marched back to his cruiser, slamming the trunk shut with enough force to make the younger officer flinch. Davis watched him go, his expression a mixture of frustration and resignation. "This is going to end badly," Davis muttered under his breath. Meanwhile, back inside the church, Lionel had begun to lay the groundwork for what he knew was coming. He had seen the look in Barnes's eyes, the kind of unchecked anger that led men to do reckless, dangerous things. And he knew that the best way to deal with someone like Barnes was to be one step ahead. As the last of the congregation members left the church, Lionel turned to Naomi. "I need you to trust me," he said. "What happens next might be difficult, but I promise you, I'll keep you and everyone here safe." Naomi nodded, though a knot of worry tightened in her chest. "What are you going to do?" Lionel didn't answer directly. Instead, he walked to the front of the church and stood for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. Finally, he turned back to Naomi. "Lock the doors," he said. "And don't let anyone else in tonight." It was nearly an hour later when Barnes returned, his patrol car pulling up to the curb with a screech of tires. This time he was alone. The other officers had left, unwilling to be dragged further into his vendetta. But Barnes didn't care. He didn't need them. He was going to handle this himself. He strode up to the church doors and tried the handle, only to find it locked. His frustration bubbled over, and he pounded on the door with his fist. "Open up," he shouted, his voice echoing in the quiet night. "This is the police!" Inside, Lionel stood just beyond the door, his expression calm as he listened to Barnes's demands. He motioned for Naomi to stay back, then opened the door just enough to meet Barnes's gaze. "Officer Barnes," Lionel said evenly. "What a surprise. I thought we'd settled this." Barnes glared at him, his face red with anger. "You don't get to decide when this is over," he spat. "Step aside and let me in." Lionel raised an eyebrow. "Do you have a warrant?" Barnes hesitated, his hand twitching near his weapon. I don't need a warrant to investigate suspicious activity, he said through gritted teeth. Lionel's expression didn't change. Actually, you do. But even if you had one, you wouldn't find anything here. This is a church, Officer Barnes, and you're making a fool of yourself. Barnes's patience snapped. He shoved the door open with enough force to send it slamming against the wall and stepped inside, his posture aggressive. Naomi gasped and stepped back, her heart racing as she watched the confrontation escalate. Enough games, Barnes growled, his voice low and dangerous. You think you're untouchable, King? Let's see how tough you are when I drag you out of here in cuffs. Lionel didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step forward, his gaze locking onto Barnes's with an intensity that made the officer hesitate. When Lionel spoke, his voice was quiet but carried a weight that sent a chill down Barnes's spine. You've already lost, Lionel said. You just don't know it yet. The church had become eerily silent, its usual atmosphere of warmth and refuge replaced by an oppressive tension. Derek Barnes stood in the middle of the sanctuary, his hand hovering near his holstered gun, his breathing heavy as his eyes darted between Lionel King and Naomi. His earlier bravado now felt forced, a thin veneer masking the growing unease he couldn't quite suppress. The weight of Lionel's calm stare bore into him, unflinching and unrelenting, as if daring him to make his next move. Naomi, standing a few steps behind her father, felt her pulse quicken. Her mind raced with questions, but she forced herself to stay silent, trusting Lionel to handle the situation. She had seen Barnes unravel over the course of the evening, his desperation escalating into recklessness. This was no longer about law enforcement or even ego, it was about a man grasping at control as it slipped through his fingers. Lionel, ever composed, took a slow step forward, closing the distance between himself and Barnes. His movements were deliberate, measured like a predator circling its prey. You've made a mistake, Barnes, he said, his voice low and even, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. And now you're too deep in to dig yourself out. Barnes's lip curled into a sneer, though the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes betrayed him. You think you can intimidate me? He spat, his voice trembling with anger. You think flashing that old FBI badge means anything? You're nothing. Just a washed-up has been hiding behind his daughter. Lionel's expression didn't waver. If the insult stung, he gave no indication. Instead, he took another step forward, his towering presence drawing a bead of sweat to Barnes's brow. You don't get it, do you? Lionel said quietly. This isn't about me. It's about you. You're standing in a church, holding innocent people hostage to your anger, your pride. And for what? To prove a point? To feel powerful? You think no one's watching? You think there won't be consequences? Barnes's jaw tightened, his hand gripping the butt of his gun. He wasn't used to this being challenged, being outmatched. His mind raced, searching for a way to regain control. But Lionel wasn't giving him an inch. The older man's calm, unshakable demeanor was like a mirror, forcing Barnes to confront his own spiraling instability. I don't need to explain myself to you, Barnes snapped, his voice rising. You think you're so smart, but I see through you. You're just another criminal hiding behind your good deeds. You don't fool me. Lionel's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile, though it held no warmth. You keep telling yourself that, he said. But the truth is you're afraid. You're afraid because you know you've lost control. And now you're standing on the edge, about to fall, and you don't even realize it. Barnes's patience snapped. With a sudden, jerky motion, he drew his gun and pointed it directly at Lionel. Gasps echoed through the church, and Naomi instinctively stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. Dad, she cried, her voice trembling. Lionel raised a hand, signaling her to stay back. His gaze never left Barnes, his expression as steady as ever. "Is this what it's come to?" he asked, his voice calm, almost pitying, pointing a gun at an unarmed man in a church. "Do you even hear yourself, Barnes? Do you see what you've become?" Barnes's hand trembled ever so slightly, the weight of the weapon suddenly feeling heavier than it should. He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came out. The silence stretched on, suffocating, until Lionel spoke again. "You're not a cop anymore," Lionel said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You're just a man with a gun, desperate to prove something. But this won't fix what's broken in you." Barnes's face twisted with rage, but before he could act, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the standoff. The church doors creaked open, and two figures entered, Sergeant Davis and the younger officer, who had left earlier. Both froze as they took in the scene, Barnes, gun drawn, standing face to face with Lionel. "Barnes," Davis barked, his voice sharp and commanding. "Stand down, now." Barnes turned his head slightly, his grip on the gun tightening. "Stay out of this, Davis," he snapped. "This has nothing to do with you." "The hell it doesn't," Davis shot back, stepping closer. "You're out of control, Barnes. Put the damn gun down before you make this worse." For a moment, Barnes seemed to teeter on the edge, his gaze flicking between Lionel and Davis. The room held its breath, the tension so thick it was almost unbearable. And then, slowly, Barnes lowered the weapon, though his face remained contorted with fury. Davis let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and motioned for the younger officer to take the gun. The officer hesitated but eventually stepped forward, his movements careful and deliberate, as he relieved Barnes of the weapon. Barnes didn't resist, though his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Lionel watched the exchange with a quiet intensity, his eyes never leaving Barnes. Even as the situation de-escalated, he remained on high alert, knowing how quickly things could spiral out of control again. "Get him out of here," Davis ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. The younger officer nodded and grabbed Barnes by the arm, guiding him toward the door. But as they reached the threshold, Barnes stopped and turned, his gaze locking onto Lionel. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You think you've won, but you haven't. I'll be back. And next time there won't be anyone to stop me." Lionel didn't respond. He simply watched as Barnes was led out into the night, the door closing behind him with a heavy thud. The room remained silent for a long moment, the weight of what had just happened settling over everyone. Naomi was the first to break the silence. "Dad," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Are you okay?" Lionel turned to her, his expression softening. "I'm fine," he said. "But this isn't over. He's right about that." "What do we do?" Naomi asked, her voice filled with both fear and determination. Lionel's gaze hardened, his jaw tightening. "We prepare," he said simply, "and we make sure that when he comes back he finds out exactly who he's dealing with." Meanwhile, outside, Barnes sat in the back of the patrol car, his hands clenched into fists, his mind racing. His humiliation burned like a fire in his chest, fueling his anger and resolve. He wouldn't let this go. He couldn't. Lionel King had made a fool of him, and he would pay for it, no matter what it took. As the patrol car pulled away from the church, Barnes's lips curled into a bitter smile. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The night outside St. Matthew's Church was unnervingly quiet after the chaos of the evening. The congregation had long since dispersed, some returning home shaken, others lingering nearby in small groups to discuss what had transpired. Inside the church, Naomi and Lionel sat side by side in the dim sanctuary, the flickering light of a few candles casting long shadows across the walls. The heavy wooden doors were locked, and silence filled the space. Naomi's hands rested on her lap, still trembling from the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She turned to look at her father, who sat with his elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on the floor. For all his outward calm, she could see the storm of emotions swirling behind his eyes. "What now?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. Lionel straightened, exhaling slowly as if weighing his words. "Barnes isn't done," he said. "Men like him don't stop until they've burned everything down or until someone stops them." Naomi's heart sank. "But he's been disarmed. He's humiliated. Surely his superiors won't let him." "His superiors are either complicit or powerless," Lionel interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "If they had any real control, he wouldn't have been allowed to act the way he did tonight." "No, Naomi, this isn't about the law anymore. It's about leverage." Naomi frowned, her mind racing. "Leverage?" Lionel nodded, his expression grim. "We have to make it clear that coming after us isn't worth the cost. And the only way to do that is to expose him and anyone protecting him for who they really are." Naomi stared at him, a sinking feeling settling in her stomach. "You're not talking about going public, are you? The media protests?" Lionel shook his head. "No. That would only draw attention to us and make it easier for Barnes to twist the narrative. We don't need public outrage. We need precision. Evidence. Facts that can't be ignored or buried. And I already have a starting point." The following morning, Lionel was up before dawn. He had spent much of the night poring over his old contacts and resources, digging into everything he could find on Derek Barnes. His years in the FBI had left him with more than just a badge and a pension. They had given him connections, tools, and instincts that most people couldn't dream of. By the time Naomi joined him in the church's small office, Lionel had a notebook filled with hastily scribbled notes and a laptop open to several tabs of classified-looking information. She watched him for a moment, her anxiety tempered by admiration for his unrelenting focus. "What did you find?" she asked, pulling up a chair beside him. Lionel looked up, his face lined with exhaustion but his eyes sharp. "Barnes has a history," he said. "It's not well documented, most of it's been buried or sanitized, but it's there. Excessive force complaints, questionable arrests, incidents swept under the rug. And then there's his transfer to Redhaven." "Let me guess," Naomi said, folding her arms. "He didn't volunteer for it." Lionel smirked faintly. "Far from it. He was forced out of his previous precinct after a botched case involving an unlawful shooting. Officially, it was classified as a misunderstanding, but the internal reports paint a different picture. Barnes's temper got the better of him, and someone got hurt. Badly." Naomi leaned forward, her stomach twisting. "And they just let him transfer here, like nothing happened." Lionel nodded grimly. "It's a pattern. Men like Barnes don't get fired, they get shuffled around. Their records cleaned up just enough to keep them out of the spotlight. But this time he made a mistake. He targeted the wrong people." Naomi arched an eyebrow. "You mean us?" "I mean you," Lionel said, his voice tinged with both pride and concern. "Barnes underestimated you, Naomi. He thought he could intimidate you, humiliate you, and move on. But you stood your ground, and now he's exposed." Naomi hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "So what do we do with all this? How do we stop him?" Lionel leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. "We use it as leverage. But first we need one more thing, confirmation of who's been protecting him. Barnes isn't acting alone. Someone higher up has been shielding him, and until we expose that connection, he'll keep coming back." Over the next 2 days, Lionel and Naomi worked tirelessly, combing through records, contacting trusted allies, and piecing together the web of corruption that had enabled Barnes's behavior. It wasn't easy. Many doors were closed to them, and some of Lionel's old contacts were reluctant to get involved, but persistence paid off. By the third night, they had everything they needed. A detailed record of Barnes's misconduct, internal memos linking his behavior to senior officials who had covered for him, and even audio recordings from whistleblowers within the department. It was a damning collection of evidence, one that painted a clear picture of systemic failure. The final confrontation came sooner than expected. Lionel had planned to deliver the evidence to key figures in law enforcement quietly, ensuring that it reached those who couldn't be bought or intimidated. But Barnes, true to form, acted first. Late that evening, as Naomi prepared to lock up the church, headlights illuminated the stained glass windows. A familiar dread filled her chest as she peeked outside and saw Barnes's patrol car parked haphazardly near the curb. He stepped out, his movements erratic, his face twisted with a dangerous mix of anger and desperation. Naomi's first instinct was to call for her father, but Lionel was already there, stepping out of the shadows with the calm authority that seemed to follow him wherever he went. "Barnes," Lionel said, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. "You've had your fun. Now it's over." Barnes laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Over? You think this is over? You've been digging into my life, trying to ruin me, but I'm not going anywhere." "No," Lionel agreed, taking a slow step forward. "You're not going anywhere, you're going down." Before Barnes could respond, Lionel held up a small device, a flash drive. "This," he said, his tone steady, "is everything I need to bury you. Every complaint, every cover-up, every lie. And it's not just about you, Barnes. It's about everyone who protected you. One word from me, and it all comes crashing down." Barnes froze, his bravado faltering. For the first time, genuine fear flickered in his eyes. "You're bluffing," he said weakly, though his voice lacked conviction. Lionel smiled faintly. "Try me?" The standoff lasted only a moment, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, Barnes took a step back, his shoulders slumping as the fight drained out of him. He looked at Lionel, then at Naomi, his expression a mixture of anger and defeat. "You'll regret this," he muttered, before turning and walking away. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was swift and decisive. Lionel's evidence reached the right hands, triggering an internal investigation that exposed not only Barnes but several senior officials who had enabled his behavior. Barnes was suspended, then formally charged with multiple counts of misconduct, including abuse of power and unlawful harassment. The department, eager to save face, issued a public apology and promised sweeping reforms. For Naomi, the victory was bittersweet. The church returned to its normal rhythm, the scars of that night slowly healing. But she knew the fight was far from over. Her father's words echoed in her mind, "Men like Barnes don't stop, someone stops them." As she stood at the pulpit one Sunday morning, addressing the congregation, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. "We've faced darkness," she said, her voice steady and strong. "But we've also seen the power of standing together, and as long as we remain united, no one can take that from us." In the back of the room, Lionel watched her with quiet pride. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time he felt hope. Together they had faced the storm, and together they had won.